Morning, good afternoon, and good evening from everyone to everyone from around the world. But let me just begin by saying my name is Rick Richman. I'm a resident scholar at AJU. We have about 1,000 people registered for this webinar, which reflects the importance of the topic and the prominence of our speaker. This is the first of 7 webinars we're going to do on the multi-front war against Israel, jointly presented by the Middle East Forum and AJU. According to Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, Israel currently finds itself in a war on 7 fronts: Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran. In this 7-part series, we're going to present experts from the Middle East Forum on each front, and we'll be doing it on Mondays at this time. The next one will be Monday, May 20th, when we'll have Daniel Pipes, the founder and president of the Middle East Forum, speaking on Gaza, and then Greg Roman on Monday, June 3rd, the director of the forum, speaking on the West Bank. And then we'll have 4 more on each of the fronts in this multi-front war. So let me give a brief introduction of Michael Rubin, who doesn't need a long one. Virtually every policymaker in this area has been reading him or hearing him speak for more than 2 decades. He's Director of Policy Analysis at the Middle East Forum, and he's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in Middle East countries, particularly Iran and Turkey. His career includes service as a Pentagon official with field experiences in Iran, Yemen, and Iraq. He's taught U.S. Navy and Marine units about regional conflicts and terrorism, and he earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Yale University. And this week, he was officially sanctioned by Iran. I'm going to turn it over to Michael for about 15 minutes to give a presentation on Iran and the strike on April 13th, the response and the current policy issues facing Israel, the United States, and the rest of the world. And then we'll have time for a brief colloquy and questions that you can put in the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. So, Michael, thank you for being here, and let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rick. Let me begin by saying there's an old Russian joke about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Russian pessimist is the one who says, you know, things have never been so bad. War, the environment, the economy, health, they couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who says, no, 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 they can always get worse. So I'm going to give a little bit of an optimistic talk right now. Now, granted, I'm a historian of Iran by training, and my friends point out that means I get paid to predict the past. Rick, you're having me talk about the future, and my critics would say I only get the past right 50% of the time, so we'll see about the future. But what I want to try to do today is highlight not just what's in the major newspapers or on radio or TV, but some of the more complicated factors behind the scenes that we seldom get enough time or to delve into, or which aren't fully appreciated in my opinion. First of all, when it comes to Iran, Iran is one of these countries with a near contiguous history going back 2,000 years. Sure, before 1935, it was called Persia, but it was all basically the same thing. When I was in grad school, we all got together on Friday nights, and all of us in Iranian studies, to try to see who could name all the leaders of Iran going back 2,000 years. And Ali Khamenei, Ruhollah Khomeini, Mohammad Reza Shah, Ahmad Shah, and you get the picture. None of us got married till we were in our 30s, but it wasn't as cool as we thought. But the point of this is you have this contiguous history, which means you not only have a political and diplomatic history, you have an intellectual history as well. And so when it comes to the creation of strategy, it's always a mistake to mirror image our own types of strategy onto Iran. Bottom line up front, Iran is a dictatorship, but it's a dictatorship by omission rather than commission. It's fundamentally different than any other dictatorship you may have thought of. I mean, whether it's Kim Jong-un in North Korea or Xi Jinping in China or Bashar al-Assad in Syria. In those places, the leader gives a command and it's followed. What happens in Iran is the leader will tell you on a weekly basis, he'll give an address, the Friday prayer sermon. When I used to live in Tehran, they used to call me Pasare Shaitani Bozorg, son of the great Satan. But I lived in the zone, the security zone around Tehran University, where this weekly, almost like a State of the Union address would be. And the Iranians are supposed to listen to it and delve from it what they are and are not allowed to do. What this means is the Iranians are allowed to do, the Revolutionary Guard is allowed to do whatever they haven't been expressly forbidden from doing. Now, that means that when you have an attack like October 7th, or before that, the 2006 war with Hezbollah, or any number of other issues, it's natural in the United States, in our intelligence community, to try to find the smoking gun, to try to find the signals intercept, listening in on this phone call or that document or what have you. But we're never going to find that because Iran essentially has a culture of plausible deniability. And therefore, we've got to stop playing into their hands because they fundamentally do things a different way than we do. I know years ago for the National Counterterrorism Center, I was asked about this notion of rogue action. And what I did after the fact was look at any numbers of incidents where the Iranians were accused of bad behavior. And then our diplomats, both Democrats and both Democrat and Republican administrations said, maybe it was just a rogue action. Maybe it was some guy going off the rails. What I found is in almost every case, including the 1994 attack on the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, the person who was in charge of that attack ended up getting promoted after the fact. So that what that tells me is this wasn't a rogue action if they're getting rewarded. Now, when it comes to the Iran, I keep saying Iran just for the ease of rhetoric, but ordinary Iranians don't particularly believe in the regime anymore. Years ago, we did telephone surveying where we took every telephone exchange in Tehran, randomized the last 4 digits so you get a good cross-section of neighborhoods. And we did economic surveying from Los Angeles. Good thing they didn't have caller ID. And Iranians culturally are much more cosmopolitan than anyone else around them. And they also are much more willing to talk. And so if you ask, how many times a week does your family eat meat? Do you think your kids are going to have a better life than you did? Has anyone lost a job in the last month, in the last year, so forth? You do the number crunching. 10% of Iranians truly believe in the Islamic Republic. These are the so-called hardliners. Another 15% think it was a good idea, but it's gone off the rails, but it could still be fixed. These are the so-called reformers. The other 75% have completely given up on the system. That does not mean that they are revolutionary, because last time they had a revolution, they had a war that killed 1 million people, the Iran-Iraq War. It means they're apathetic. And the Iranians, when I used to live there, told me a joke about the apathy, about an Iranian woman who's getting married. On her wedding night, she tells her husband, I probably should have told you this before, but this is my second marriage. And the husband goes, what? She says, no, don't worry, I'm still a virgin. Well, how can that be? Well, she said, well, Hassan Rouhani, the former president, was like my first husband. He kept promising to do it, promising to do it, promising to do it. And after 8 years, he didn't touch a thing. So Iranians are apathetic, but we keep seeing that there is a growing tendency towards outrage, towards sparks, which lead to mass protests. I lived in Iran during the 1999 student uprising. Again, the first major uprising since the Islamic Revolution. 2 years later, there was an uprising when Iran lost 3-1 in a World Cup qualifier to lowly Bahrain. And rumors spread that the government forced the team to throw the match so men and women wouldn't dance together in the street. 2009, you all remember the post-election unrest when Ahmadinejad was awarded a second term, even though the voters didn't want to give him one. Then, of course, you've had environmental protests, labor protests, economic protests, and most recently, the Woman Life Freedom Movement. Clearly, the Iranian regime is a zombie regime. It's lost all legitimacy, but it's the guys with the guns that matter. Now, in intelligence, we always talk about what we know, but just as important in Iran is what we don't know. We talk about hardliners versus reformers in politics, but what are the factional divisions within the Revolutionary Guard Corps? Can we say that this general or that lieutenant is a hardliner or just a cynic, just in it for the privilege? Are they true believers? You know, it's possible to go, I mean, when Ahmadinejad, the former president who was famous for his Holocaust denial, was spouting off, a lot of people said, this is so ridiculous. It's just for internal consumption. He doesn't really believe it. But you can go into the Revolutionary Guard at age 8 because they run the equivalent of after-school programs. You can think of them like evil Boy Scouts. And then they run their own universities. And if you've gone into the bubble at age 8, maybe you have been indoctrinated. Likewise, in 2007, the US had already overthrown Saddam Hussein. The Taliban had been pushed back. The leader of the Revolutionary Guard at the time said, you know, the big threat to the revolution isn't going to come from outside because Israel is a paper tiger, he said, and I'm quoting, the Americans can't do a damn thing. Rather, the threat's going to be from inside. So he took the Revolutionary Guard, he put 1 unit in every province with the idea of keeping control on society. Here's something else we don't know. Are each of those provincial units native to the provinces in which they serve? That will tell you whether, given the order to fire in the crowds in the street, kinship trumps ideology or not. So it's a complicated situation. And the reason why I bring that up has to do with the nuclear issue and deterrence. A lot of people will say, probably not in this audience, but in general, you know, even if Iran does develop nuclear weapons, they're not suicidal. So what's the big deal? Well, let me answer that. That's a straw man argument. I don't think the Iranians are suicidal, but it's the wrong question to ask. If Iran had nuclear weapons, who would control them? It would be the most trusted and ideologically pure unit of the Revolutionary Guards. Now, here's the thing. What happens if you have an uprising, like we've had with increasing frequency, but instead of the security forces putting down the uprising, it's like Romania in 1989. You know the regime is about to fall. You only have 24 hours left. What's to stop the regime, the Revolutionary Guards in that case, from launching, knowing that their regime is over anyway? In effect, the question shouldn't be with Iran's nuclear weapons, whether or not they're suicidal. The question should be whether or not they are terminally ill. That's where deterrence goes out the window. But what about what just happened? You know, a lot of people will say, Israel restored deterrence, and Iran showed itself unable to really strike effectively. I'm sorry, but I'm going to throw cold water on that. Iran launched ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, more than 300 of them. And Israel and its allies did yeoman's work to knock down most of them. But at least 7 missiles got through. Now, let me ask you this. What happens if those missiles had biological, chemical, or nuclear warheads? Would we still be talking about this as not being an Iranian victory? But what about Israel's response, something which the Biden administration really pressured Netanyahu to scale it down to end this? Well, Israel showed, from our perspective, that they could penetrate Iranian airspace, and with precision, they could knock out S-300 anti-aircraft missiles from around Isfahan. Is that a victory, a quiet victory? Again, I would say no. Because while the United States, and I'm borrowing this from my Iranian friend Sheikh Hatari, focuses on data, from Supreme Leader Khamenei's point of view, the issue is honor. The issue is pride. And so what he's shown is he's able to send 300 drones and missiles to Israel. And even though the Israelis struck back successfully in Isfahan, that's not on Iranian television. So what he's doing is showing his base, I have restored deterrence against Israel. And when you have that sort of overconfidence, it's extraordinarily dangerous. On top of which, you have the ticking clock. And I don't just mean the ticking clock on Iran's nuclear program and enrichment. Ali Khamenei, 3 weeks ago, turned 85 years old. He's had cancer twice. He's partially paralyzed. He's not going to live forever. He wants to see the eradication of the state of Israel, and he figures he doesn't have much time to act. So even if there's a ceasefire announced today, as there has been, although the devil's in the details, I don't believe it. I don't believe that Khamenei has given up his ideological prerogative, because this problem between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Israel isn't a problem of grievance. It's not about if the Palestinians have a state. Fundamentally, it's about ideology. But I've thrown a lot out there, Rick, and I want to have time for some back and forth and some Q&A. So why don't I leave it there? I hope I've been provocative enough, and I'm willing to go off on any tangents you might have.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was a terrific presentation. Um, Let me broaden the scope a little bit and follow up on your analysis of the nuclear program. I understand your point that deterrence is not a reliable strategy. Let's turn to negotiations and the prospect for them, because as I look at what the Biden administration did, they came into office, they wanted to reinstate the JCPOA, the Iran deal, as a platform for a stronger and longer agreement, which is sort of an implicit acknowledgement that the JCPOA was too short and too weak. And then Iran rejected that, and the administration sought to simply reinstate the JCPOA without change, and Iran rejected that. And then the administration put forth a so-called less for less suggestion of less sanction relief for less compliance with the JCPOA, and Iran rejected that. And in the last year, we haven't heard much, except that we've seen Iran continually building its nuclear facilities and its nuclear stockpiles. My question to you is negotiation something that is possible or advisable with the Iranian regime? And if not, what policy should we be following now with respect to the nuclear program?
Well, Rick, it's a great question. First of all, in military academies in the United States, they teach the so-called DIME paradigm, that every strategy should have a diplomatic, an informational, a military, and an economic component, and that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If you want your diplomacy to be effective, you need to have coercion. Unfortunately, across administrations, and this is the culture of our State Department, we want to try diplomacy first. We want to be the nice guy. And if that doesn't work, maybe we're thinking about sanctions and we try to sequence it. That doesn't really work. When I used to teach for the Navy, and I would teach on almost every carrier that would deploy across the Atlantic or across the Pacific to the Middle East during the 3-week transit period, I would ask admirals, if we wanted our diplomacy toward Iran to be successful, what posture should our U.S. Navy take? And to a man and a woman, what they would say is, if you want the Iranians to take our diplomats seriously, that they're not just on double secret probation, to make an old Animal House analogy, we actually mean it. What we need to do is take all our aircraft carriers out of the Persian Gulf, which may seem counterintuitive, and park them 400 miles off the coast of Iran in the northern Indian Ocean. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to actually pull our carriers back, but the reason for that is the Persian Gulf is extremely narrow and shallow. The Persian Gulf is at its deepest about 300 feet. Its average depth is 100 feet, which means that its deepest point is actually shallower than Lake Michigan's average point. Now, the point of this is, it's hard to maneuver an aircraft carrier like that. And you have to worry about Iranian drones, small boats, mines, missiles, and so forth. If we're 400 miles off the coast of Iran, we can hit them, they can't hit us. That's when their diplomats start to pay attention. That shows seriousness, and we don't posture like that. When we went into the joint plan of action, before the comprehensive plan of action, Iran's economy had shrank, according to its own statistics, 5.4%. We don't build leverage by giving them $1 billion a month to come to the negotiating table, which unfortunately is what Secretary of State John Kerry did. So maximum pressure works. It helped release the hostages in 1981. It also helped end the Iran-Iraq war. Ayatollah Khamenei in 1988 got on the radio, and I'm quoting, he said, "It's like drinking from a chalice of poison, but I have no choice but to drink from this cup if I want the regime to survive." The question we should then be asking is what are we doing to fill that chalice of poison? Again, I would suggest to you, Rick, that it's not giving billions of dollars in aid and incentive. And indeed, even though Washington is everything's a partisan football right now, if you actually line up the timelines, the Iranian enrichment program didn't take off when President Trump left the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It took off when Joe Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken ended the maximum pressure campaign. I would argue that the best thing we could do is reimpose the maximum pressure campaign. And then if we want to negotiate around the margins, we can.
Well, that leads me to this, which is, what do you expect to happen in the next 6 months? Because we're in a sort of zone of danger. I think we don't know who is going to be president in January. We have the Democratic and Republican conventions coming up, which may see a lot of Middle East demonstrations, perhaps at both conventions. We have the election coming up in November. So what is that a time of paralysis for the United States and a time of opportunity for Iran to take advantage of that?
The short answer is yes and yes. And Iran wouldn't be the first country to do this. We saw this sort of thing, for example, prior to the 2008 election, when Russia decided to use that time to invade Georgia. We've seen Russia do likewise, not with this current Ukraine war, but in 2014 as well with regard to the Crimea. The fact of the matter is, our opponents are very, very sophisticated, and whether Democrats or Republicans are in office or seeking to be in office, oftentimes Washington delves into an orgy of navel gazing, which our adversaries take advantage of that. And we need to be prepared for this. But there's also another uncertainty out there, Rick. And the fact of the matter, like I said, Khamenei is 85 years old. He's a cancer survivor. He's partially paralyzed. Say what you will, and my friends may say I only get history right 50% of the time, let alone my crystal ball, but I will put money on the bet that octogenarian ayatollahs don't have a high lifespan. So, looking at that, what happens if Khamenei himself falls? Then we have actually a mad dash. It would be when Khomeini, the leader of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, died on June 3rd, 1989. There's a heat wave in Tehran. The quip on the streets of Iran was the old man was so senile he forgot to close the door on the way down. Well, and Khamenei, the current supreme leader, was actually picked because he was perceived to be weak. He was perceived to be colorless. He was a compromise candidate. 35 years on, he's worth more than $100 billion. The Revolutionary Guard is also worth more than $100 billion. Everyone's going to come out of the woodwork if you only have one transition every 35 years to try to win that lottery. It's going to be a mess. On top of which, is the Revolutionary Guard really going to subordinate themselves and their $100 million plus billion dollar plus enterprise to someone they don't trust? So you do really have, while many people assume, oh, the revolution will spin itself out, you actually could have a cycle of reinforcement of the most hardline revolutionary values as the Revolutionary Guard sort of acts as the gatekeeper to the next supreme leader.
Well, let me ask you one question that's been submitted by one of our listeners. Has the shadow war between Iran and Israel been restored, or will it stay, or even escalate out of the shadows? What do you see either in the next 6 months or over the next year?
Short answer is yes, it will probably continue. The Iranians need to be asking how it is that the Israelis have such good intelligence about the interworkings of what's going on, and not just the Israelis, the Saudis, and others. But the fact of the matter is, I'm all for the shadow war, because if you can achieve with a scalpel what you need to achieve, then you don't need to wield an axe. And the problem with a military attack on Iran is 6 times the size of Great Britain, 4 times the size of Iraq. Unlike the Israeli strike on Osirak in Iraq in 1981, which was a single target, or in Deir ez-Zor in Syria, the plutonium processing plant in 2007, which was a single target, Iran has their targets spread all over the place. Now, the Israelis can fly in with surprise, but they're not going to be able to drop their ordnance and fly out with surprise. And when we look at what happened in early April with the strikes on Isfahan. This actually signals one of the big issues. Because Israeli pilots aren't suicidal, before they go after the nuclear sites, they're going to have to go after anti-aircraft batteries, enemy airfields, and command and control. And then you go after the nuclear sites, and you have to do those multiple times. The only good news is those nuclear sites that are buried under mountains, that's not as difficult as some people in the press make it out to be, because you don't need to destroy those nuclear sites. You only need to destroy the entrances.
Another question is, what prevents a successful internal revolt in Iran if so much of the population is opposed to the regime?
Yeah, again, it's the guys with the guns that matter. And again, the difference between the Iranian army is the Iranian army is in charge of territorial defense. They're analogous without moral equivalence to our army. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is charged with defense of the revolution. And by the way, in their founding statutes, their goal is, and so, sorry, the enemies can be external or internal. In their founding statutes, their goal is to export revolution. That's where we get the so-called axis of resistance. And you'll have a whole series on this with Yemen, with Hezbollah, with Syria, and so forth.
Here's a question about sanctions and Iranian sales of oil, which, according to the Wall Street Journal, hit a 6-year high last month, with most of the sales of oil going to China. So it's kind of a double whammy against American policy. What is happening with sanctions, and why aren't they being enforced?
Basically, what's happened is the White House, and specifically National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, think that somehow if we trade with Iran or if we don't enforce the sanctions, if we provide relief, that could be a bolster for the so-called reformers inside Iran. What he doesn't understand is, number one, the reformers don't control the security portfolios. And number two, the reformers are ideologically as much theocrats as the hardliners are. After the Woman Life Freedom Movement, how many reformers did you see actually resign? Foundation for Defense of Democracy has done some really, really good work on this. But that's why I would argue we need maximum pressure. And if I may, Rick, it's a little bit off the subject, but when it comes to sanctions and so forth, a lot of the same groups which are funding Iran are also funding the campus protests. I would just like to shout out Middle East Forum's work. If you go to the Middle East Forum webpage, in helping organize a RICO racketeering suit against the conspiracy which has allowed this to happen. The same thing that took down the mafia, that Middle East Forum wants to take down Students for Justice in Palestine.
Well, we're going to have to end here in a minute, but let me read you a comment from Carla in Canada. Mr. Rubin is one of the best speakers I've heard on these issues, precise, concise, specific, easily understood, and humorous. Please invite him back for longer, more in-depth conversations. I wish we could have more time, Michael. Your insights very, very valuable, and thank you. And to everybody listening here, we're going to do this again in 2 weeks on Monday, May 20th, with Daniel Pipes, the president and founder of the Middle East Forum, and we'll be talking about Gaza. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Michael, again.